Andrew Ruiz stood in the doorway of his apartment, hand gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He said, "I should probably go," but his feet remained planted on the hardwood floor, his body refusing to follow through on the words that had tumbled from his lips. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows behind John Turner, casting golden shadows across the living room they had spent the last 3 hours talking in, and Andrew felt something electric pass between them in the silence that followed his half-hearted declaration. John looked up from where he sat on the edge of the couch, his dark eyes searching Andrew's face with an intensity that made Andrew's breath catch in his throat. The space between them felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy with possibility and unspoken truths that neither of them seemed brave enough to voice. Andrew's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched John's gaze drop to his lips for just a moment before flickering back up to meet his eyes. "You keep saying that," John said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but you never actually leave." Andrew felt heat rise in his cheeks, a flush of embarrassment mixed with something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken and his palms grow damp. He had been coming to John's apartment for weeks now, always with some excuse, some reason that seemed perfectly logical in the moment, but felt transparent in hindsight. Today it had been returning a book he had borrowed months ago, a thin volume of poetry that had been sitting on his nightstand gathering dust until he finally worked up the courage to use it as a reason to see John again. The truth was, Andrew had been struggling with feelings he didn't fully understand, emotions that had been building inside him like pressure in a sealed container, threatening to burst free at the most inconvenient moments. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. He found himself thinking about John at the strangest times during meetings at work, while grocery shopping, in the quiet moments before sleep, when his mind was free to wander down paths he usually tried to avoid during daylight hours. "I don't know what you mean," Andrew said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded unconvincing. He finally released his grip on the doorframe, letting his hand fall to his phone, but still made no move to actually leave the apartment. John stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and careful, like he was approaching a skittish animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. He took a step closer to Andrew, close enough that Andrew could smell his cologne, something warm and woody that made Andrew's head spin slightly. "Don't you?" John asked, and there was something in his voice that made Andrew's stomach flip, a gentleness mixed with challenge that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. The silence stretched between them again, filled with the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Andrew found himself cataloging every detail of the moment, the way the light caught the flecks of gold in John's brown eyes, the slight curve of his lips that might have been the beginning of a smile, the way his hair fell across his forehead in a way that made Andrew want to reach out and brush it back with his fingers. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, suspended between leaving and staying, between friendship and something more, we need to go back to the beginning, to the first time Andrew had felt that strange flutter in his chest when John smiled at him across a crowded coffee shop 3 months earlier. Andrew had been having what could generously be called a terrible day. He had been running late for work, his coffee maker had broken, spilling grounds all over his kitchen counter, and he had gotten caught in an unexpected downpour that left his carefully styled hair plastered to his head and his shirt clinging uncomfortably to his skin. By the time he ducked into the little cafe near his office, he was feeling frazzled and slightly defeated, just looking for a quick caffeine fix before facing the rest of his day. The cafe was packed with the usual morning rush crowd, a sea of suits and laptops and the constant hum of conversation punctuated by the hiss of the espresso machine. Andrew had been standing in line, checking his phone and trying to calculate whether he would be more than fashionably late for his 9 o'clock meeting when he heard someone say his name. "Andrew, right?" the voice had said, and when Andrew looked up, he found himself staring into the face of John Turner, someone he recognized but had never really talked to before. They had mutual friends, moved in similar social circles, but had never done more than exchange polite hellos at parties or group gatherings. John was smiling at him, a warm, genuine expression that seemed to light up his entire face, and Andrew felt something shift inside his chest, a strange fluttering sensation that he couldn't quite identify. "Yeah, hi," Andrew had managed to say, suddenly very aware of how disheveled he must look, his damp hair and wrinkled shirt making him feel like a mess in comparison to John's effortless, put-together appearance. Rough morning, John had observed, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners in what might have been amusement, but there was no mockery in his voice, just a kind of gentle understanding that made Andrew's shoulders relax slightly. You could say that, Andrew had replied, running a hand through his still damp hair in a gesture that was part nervous habit, part attempt to make himself look slightly more presentable. My coffee maker decided to stage a rebellion. John had laughed at that, a rich, warm sound that made something in Andrew's stomach do a little flip. Coffee maker rebellions are the worst, he had said with mock seriousness, completely unpredictable and always poorly timed. There had been something about the easy way John talked to him, like they were old friends instead of virtual strangers, that made Andrew feel immediately at ease despite his frazzled state. When John had suggested they sit together, claiming he had some time before his first appointment, Andrew had found himself saying yes without really thinking about it. They had found a small table by the window, and what Andrew had intended to be a quick coffee break had turned into an hour-long conversation that left him feeling energized in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. John was funny and smart and surprisingly easy to talk to, and Andrew found himself sharing stories and opinions he normally kept to himself, drawn out by John's genuine interest in the way he listened with his full attention. It was during that first conversation that Andrew had started to notice things about John that he had never paid attention to before. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the graceful movement of his hands when he talked, the way he had a habit of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking about something. These observations had felt innocent enough at the time, just the natural result of actually paying attention to someone for the first time instead of simply exchanging pleasantries. But over the following weeks, as their chance encounter had led to more intentional meetings, coffee dates that became lunch dates, that became long conversations that stretched into the evening, Andrew had started to realize that his interest in John went beyond simple friendship. He found himself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that felt different from his excitement about seeing other friends. He caught himself thinking about things John had said days after their conversations, replaying moments and analyzing them for meanings that might or might not have been there. The realization that he might be developing feelings for John had hit Andrew like a physical blow one evening about 6 weeks after their first coffee shop encounter. They had been walking through the park near Andrew's apartment, discussing a movie they had both seen, when John had stopped suddenly to point out a particular tree whose leaves had turned a brilliant shade of red in the autumn light. "Look at that," John had said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. And when Andrew had turned to look at him instead of the tree, he had been struck by the expression on John's face, the way the golden hour light played across his features, the slight smile that curved his lips as he appreciated the simple beauty of the moment. Andrew's heart had done something complicated in his chest, a stuttering rhythm that left him slightly breathless, and he had realized with startling clarity that he was falling for John Turner in a way that he had never fallen for anyone before. The thought had been both thrilling and terrifying, opening up possibilities he had never seriously considered, while simultaneously threatening to complicate what had become one of the most important relationships in his life. That night, Andrew had lain awake staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, trying to make sense of the feelings that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, but also felt like they had been building slowly beneath the surface for weeks. He had dated women exclusively throughout his 20s, had even been in what he thought was a serious relationship with Christine Castillo for nearly 2 years before they had mutually agreed that something essential was missing between them. The breakup with Christine had been amicable but confusing. They had been compatible in so many ways, shared interests and values and a genuine affection for each other, but there had always been something that felt forced about their physical intimacy, something that left Andrew feeling like he was going through the motions rather than being genuinely moved by desire. Christine had felt it too, he knew, though neither of them had been able to articulate exactly what was wrong. Now, lying in his dark bedroom and thinking about the way his pulse had quickened when John smiled at him, Andrew wondered if he was finally beginning to understand what had been missing from his relationship with Christine and every other woman he had dated. The possibility that he might be attracted to men, specifically to John, felt like a revelation and a complication in equal measure. Over the following days, Andrew had found himself paying closer attention to his reactions around John, cataloging the way his heart rate increased when John laughed at something he said, the way he felt a strange flutter in his stomach when their hands accidentally brushed reaching for the same menu, the way he caught himself staring at John's mouth when he talked and wondering what it would feel like to kiss him. These observations had only confirmed what Andrew was beginning to suspect about himself, but they had also raised a host of new questions and concerns. He had no idea how John felt about him, whether their easy friendship and obvious compatibility translated into any kind of romantic or physical attraction on John's part. More importantly, he had no idea how to navigate these new feelings without potentially destroying the friendship that had become so important to him. Andrew had always been someone who preferred certainty to ambiguity, who liked to have a clear understanding of situations before taking action. But his feelings for John existed in a realm of uncertainty that left him feeling off balance and unsure of himself in ways that were both frustrating and oddly exhilarating. He found himself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs that might indicate John's feelings, while simultaneously trying not to read too much into friendly gestures that might mean nothing more than friendship. The tension of this uncertainty had been building for weeks, creating a strange dynamic between them that Andrew wasn't sure John had noticed, but that left Andrew feeling like he was walking on increasingly thin ice. Every conversation felt charged with subtext. Every casual touch seemed loaded with meaning. And Andrew found himself caught between the desire to confess his feelings and the fear of ruining what they already had. The situation had reached a breaking point the previous week when John hadn't invited Andrew over for dinner, a casual invitation that had sent Andrew's imagination spinning with possibilities, even as he tried to convince himself it was just two friends sharing a meal. Andrew had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, settling on jeans and a button-down shirt that Christine had once told him brought out the color of his eyes, then immediately second-guessing the choice and wondering if he was trying too hard. John's apartment had been warm and inviting, filled with the smell of something delicious cooking and the soft jazz music that John favored for background ambiance. They had opened a bottle of wine while John finished preparing dinner, and Andrew had found himself relaxing into the comfortable domestic rhythm of their evening together, helping with small tasks and enjoying the easy conversation that flowed between them. It was during dinner that John had brought up his recent breakup with Nancy Kelly, a relationship that had apparently ended several weeks earlier, but that John was only now ready to discuss in detail. Andrew had known about Nancy in abstract terms, had met her briefly at a party where she had seemed pleasant enough, but he had never heard John talk about their relationship with any real depth or emotion. "I think the problem," John had said, twirling pasta around his fork with more concentration than the task required, "was that I kept waiting to feel something that never came. She's a wonderful person, smart and funny and beautiful, but there was always something missing." Andrew had felt his heart rate increase at these words, though he tried to keep his expression neutral and supportive. "What kind of something?" he had asked, taking a sip of wine to cover the slight tremor in his voice. John had been quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on his plate, as if the answer might be written in the arrangement of his food. "I don't know exactly," he had finally said. "Connection, maybe. The feeling that someone really sees you, understands you in a way that goes beyond just compatibility." The conversation had continued in this vein for the rest of the evening, with John opening up about his frustrations with dating and his growing sense that he might be looking for the wrong things in relationships. Andrew had found himself in the strange position of offering relationship advice while simultaneously hoping that John's dissatisfaction with his romantic life might somehow create an opening for something between them. By the time Andrew had reluctantly said he should probably head home, the wine and intimate conversation had created an atmosphere that felt charged with possibility. They had stood by the door saying goodbye for what felt like an unusually long time, neither seeming eager to end the evening, and Andrew had been acutely aware of the small space between them and the way John's eyes seemed to linger on his face. It was then that John had done something that had replayed in Andrew's mind countless times over the following week. As Andrew had reached for the door handle, John had placed a hand on his arm just above his elbow, a touch that was light but somehow electric. "Thanks for listening," John had said, his voice soft and sincere. "It means more than you know." The touch had lasted only a few seconds, But it had left Andrew's skin tingling long after he had walked home through the quiet streets to his own apartment. He had spent that night and many nights since analyzing every aspect of the moment. The warmth of John's palm through his shirt, the way John had looked at him when he said those words, the reluctance with which they had both let the evening end. That had been the beginning of what Andrew now recognized as a pattern. He would find reasons to visit John's apartment, ostensibly to return borrowed items or discuss work projects, or simply to continue conversations they had started elsewhere. Each visit would end with Andrew announcing that he should go, but then lingering in the doorway for increasingly long periods, neither of them seeming eager to actually end their time together. Today's visit had followed the same script, but with a new intensity that left Andrew feeling like they were approaching some kind of threshold. He had arrived mid-afternoon with the excuse of returning the poetry book, but they had quickly moved beyond that pretext to talk about everything and nothing, the kind of rambling conversation that felt both comfortable and charged with unspoken tension. John had made coffee, and they had settled on opposite ends of his couch. But as the afternoon progressed, they had gradually moved closer together until Andrew was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from John's body and the way their knees occasionally brushed when one of them shifted position. The conversation had meandered through topics both serious and silly, but underneath it all, Andrew had felt the constant hum of attraction and possibility that had been building between them for weeks. It was when John had mentioned feeling restless lately, like he was waiting for something to happen but didn't know what, that Andrew had felt his resolve beginning to crack. The way John had looked at him when he said this, with an expression that seemed both vulnerable and searching, had made Andrew's heart race in a way that felt dangerous and thrilling. "I know the feeling," Andrew had managed to say, though the words felt inadequate to express the complex mix of longing and uncertainty that had been his constant companion for weeks. "Sometimes it feels like you're standing at the edge of something, but you're not sure if you're supposed to jump or step back." John had nodded at this, his eyes never leaving Andrew's face, and there had been something in his expression that made Andrew wonder if they were talking about the same thing, if John was feeling the same tension and possibility that seemed to crackle in the air between them. That's when Andrew had announced that he should probably go, the words coming out more abruptly than he had intended, as if his rational mind had suddenly realized how close he was to saying or doing something that might change everything between them. But even as he said it, even as he stood up and moved toward the door, he had known that he didn't really want to leave, that what he actually wanted was for John to give him a reason to stay. Now, standing in the doorway with John just a few feet away, Andrew felt like they were balanced on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from either flying or falling. The late afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room. And in the golden glow, Andrew could see something in John's expression that looked like the same mixture of hope and fear that was churning in his own chest. "You're doing it again," John said, taking another step closer. And Andrew could hear something new in his voice, a kind of gentle challenge that made his breath catch. "Saying you're going to leave, but not actually leaving." Andrew felt heat rise in his cheeks again, embarrassment mixed with something that might have been relief at finally having the pattern acknowledged out loud. "Maybe I don't really want to go," he said, the words coming out quieter than he had intended, barely above a whisper. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession, and Andrew felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for John's response. He was acutely aware of every detail of the moment, the way the light fell across John's face, the sound of their breathing in the quiet apartment, the small space between them that seemed both insurmountable and easily crossed. "Then why do you keep saying it?" John asked, and there was something in his voice that made Andrew look up and meet his eyes directly for the first time since this conversation had started. What he saw there made his stomach flip, a warmth and intensity that seemed to mirror his own feelings. Andrew opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, struggling to find words that would adequately express the tangle of emotions and fears that had been keeping him in this state of suspended animation for weeks. How could he explain that he was terrified of ruining their friendship by admitting feelings that might not be reciprocated? How could he articulate the way his understanding of himself had been shifting and changing, leaving him feeling uncertain about things he had thought he knew for sure? "I guess," Andrew started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in the nervous gesture that John had probably seen dozens of times by now. I guess I'm scared of what might happen if I stay. John's expression softened at this admission, and he took another small step closer, close enough now that Andrew could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with coffee and something that was purely John. Scared of what? He asked gently, and there was no judgment in his voice, just genuine curiosity and concern. Andrew felt something loosen in his chest at the kindness in John's tone. The way he was approaching this conversation with the same care and attention he brought to everything else. Of changing things, Andrew said, his voice barely above a whisper. Of saying something I can't take back. The silence that followed felt different from the charged tension of earlier, softer somehow, like they had moved into new territory where honesty was not only possible but necessary. John reached out slowly, giving Andrew time to pull away if he wanted to, and placed his hand on Andrew's arm in the same spot he had touched him the week before. What if changing things isn't necessarily bad, John said, his thumb tracing a small circle against Andrew's sleeve that sent electricity shooting through Andrew's entire body. What if some changes are worth the risk? Andrew felt his breath catch at the words and the touch, at the implication that John might be feeling some version of what Andrew had been experiencing for weeks. He looked down at John's hand on his arm, then back up to meet his eyes, searching for confirmation of what he thought he was hearing. Are we still talking, hypothetically? Andrew asked, and he was proud that his voice came out steadier than he felt, though he couldn't do anything about the way his heart was racing or the slight tremor in his hands. John's smile was soft and a little uncertain, but there was something in his eyes that made Andrew's stomach flip in the best possible way. I don't think we've been talking hypothetically for a while now, John said, and the admission felt like a door opening between them, revealing possibilities that Andrew had been afraid to even imagine. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them consciously moving closer, and Andrew found himself studying John's face with new permission, taking in the curve of his lips and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, and the way he was looking at Andrew like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. John, Andrew said, his name coming out like a question or maybe a prayer, and he saw something shift in John's expression, a kind of recognition or decision that made Andrew's pulse quicken even further. I've been thinking about you, John said, his voice soft but clear, and the words hit Andrew like a physical force, making him feel dizzy with relief and possibility. About this, about us, about what it might mean. Andrew felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet, like the world had tilted slightly on its axis to reveal a new landscape of possibility that he had been afraid to believe in. How long, he managed to ask, though his voice came out rougher than he had intended. Weeks, John admitted, his hand still resting on Andrew's arm, his thumb still tracing those small circles that were making it difficult for Andrew to think clearly. Maybe longer. I kept telling myself it was just friendship, just enjoying spending time with someone who gets me. But then you'd smile at me or laugh at something I said, and I'd feel this flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with friendship. Andrew felt something break open inside him at these words, a flood of relief and joy and terror all mixed together. You felt it too, he said, and it wasn't really a question because he could see the truth of it in John's eyes, in the way he was looking at Andrew like he was something precious and fragile and worth taking risks for. I thought I was going crazy, John continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I kept analyzing every conversation we had, looking for signs that you might feel the same way, but I was so scared of misreading things and ruining what we had. Andrew laughed at this, a sound that was part relief and part amazement at the parallel paths their thoughts had been taking. I've been doing the exact same thing, he said, driving myself crazy, wondering if you were just being friendly or if there was something more. The revelation that they had both been caught in the same cycle of uncertainty and longing seemed to shift something between them, dissolving some of the tension while simultaneously increasing the electricity that seemed to arc in the small space that still separated them. Andrew found himself really looking at John's mouth for the first time, allowing himself to wonder what it would feel like to kiss him, what it would be like to close the distance between them and find out if the reality could possibly live up to the fantasies that had been building in his mind for weeks. I don't know what I'm doing, Andrew admitted, his honesty surprising him even as the words left his mouth. I've never felt this way about a man before. Never even really considered the possibility. But with you, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. John's smile at this confession was warm and understanding, and he moved his hand from Andrew's arm to cup his cheek, a touch that was gentle and electric and full of promise. "You don't have to know what you're doing," he said softly. "We can figure it out together." The offer hung in the air between them, an invitation to step into unknown territory together, to explore whatever this was between them without needing to have all the answers first. Andrew felt himself leaning slightly into John's touch, his eyes fluttering closed for just a moment at the simple pleasure of being touched with such tenderness and intention. When he opened his eyes again, John was looking at him with an expression that was soft and warm and full of affection, and Andrew felt something settle into place inside his chest, a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. "This is terrifying," he said, but he was smiling as he said it, and he saw his smile reflected back in John's eyes. "The best things usually are," John replied, his thumb brushing across Andrew's cheekbone in a gesture that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. "Can I ask you something?" Andrew nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak, too overwhelmed by the combination of John's touch and the intensity of the moment to form coherent words. "Can I kiss you?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and the question sent Andrew's heart into overdrive, making him feel like he might actually faint from the combination of anticipation and desire that flooded through him. "Yes," Andrew managed to say, though the word came out more like a breath than actual speech, and he saw John's smile widen just before he leaned in to close the distance between them. The first touch of John's lips against his was soft and tentative, a gentle question that Andrew answered by pressing closer, his hands coming up to rest on John's chest as he felt himself melting into the kiss. It was nothing like kissing Christine or any of the other women he had dated. Nothing like the mechanical motions he had gone through in previous relationships while wondering why he felt so disconnected from the experience. This kiss felt like coming home and setting off on an adventure at the same time, like discovering a part of himself he hadn't known was missing. John's lips were warm and soft against his, and when John deepened the kiss slightly, Andrew felt a rush of sensation that made his knees weak and his heart race in ways that were entirely new to him. They broke apart after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, both breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to process what had just happened between them. Andrew could still taste John on his lips, could still feel the warmth of his body pressed close, and he found himself wondering how he had lived for 28 years without knowing that kissing could feel like this. "Wow," John said softly, his breath warm against Andrew's face, and Andrew felt himself smile at the simple honesty of the reaction. "Yeah," Andrew agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "That was," he started, then trailed off, unable to find adequate words to describe the way the kiss had made him feel, the way it had seemed to rearrange something fundamental inside him. "Perfect," John finished for him, and Andrew nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes at the rightness of the word, at the way John seemed to understand exactly what he was experiencing. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other and breathing together, and Andrew felt like he was memorizing every detail of the moment. The way John's hair felt under his fingers, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the way the afternoon light had shifted to cast everything in a warm golden glow. "What happens now?" Andrew asked eventually, though he was reluctant to break the spell of the moment with practical concerns about the future. John pulled back slightly so he could look at Andrew's face, his hands still resting on Andrew's waist, his expression serious but warm. "Now we figure it out one day at a time," he said. "We talk about what this means for both of us. We take things at whatever pace feels right, and we don't put pressure on ourselves to have everything figured out immediately." Andrew felt something relax in his chest at John's measured response, at the way he was approaching this new development with the same thoughtfulness and care that he brought to everything else. "I've never done this before," Andrew said, feeling like the admission was important, like John should know what he was getting into. "I know," John replied, his voice gentle and reassuring. "And that's okay. I've dated men before, but I've never felt anything like what I feel for you. So in a lot of ways, this is new for me too." The admission that John had experience with men, while Andrew didn't show it and have, made Andrew feel more nervous, but instead it was oddly comforting. The idea that John could help guide him through this new territory while they explored whatever was developing between them together. I should probably actually go now, Andrew said, though he made no move to step away from John's embrace, and they both laughed at the familiar words that had taken on an entirely new meaning in the space of the last hour. Should you, John asked, his voice teasing but warm, and Andrew could see the smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, Andrew said, pretending to consider the question seriously, I suppose I could stay a little longer, if you wanted me to. John's smile widened into a grin that made Andrew's heart skip a beat. I want you to stay, he said simply. I want you to stay for dinner, and I want to talk about everything and nothing. And I want to figure out what this is between us without rushing or putting pressure on either of us. Andrew felt a wave of affection wash over him at John's words, at the way he was being so careful and considerate, even in the midst of what was clearly a significant moment for both of them. Okay, he said, leaning in to press a soft kiss to John's lips, marveling at how natural the gesture already felt. I'll stay. They moved back into the living room together, settling on the couch with a new awareness of each other that made even simple gestures feel charged with meaning. John made more coffee while Andrew called in sick to work for the next day, claiming a sudden onset of stomach flu that would require at least 24 hours of recovery time. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation and gentle touches, long talks about their fears and hopes and the way their feelings had been developing over the past few months. They talked about Andrew's confusion about his sexuality and John's patient willingness to let him explore these new feelings at his own pace. They talked about their concerns about how this might change their friend group dynamics and their excitement about the possibility of building something real together. As the evening wore on, they found themselves gravitating closer together on the couch, until Andrew was leaning against John's side with John's arm around his shoulders, both of them marveling at how natural and right it felt to be physically close in this new way. They shared more kisses, each one feeling like both a discovery and a homecoming. And Andrew found himself wondering how he had spent so many years feeling like something was missing, without understanding what that something might be. When it finally came time for Andrew to actually leave well past midnight, and only because they both had work obligations the next day that couldn't be avoided, the goodbye felt different from all the previous ones. There was no hesitation or uncertainty, no lingering in the doorway while trying to work up the courage to say what they were really thinking. Instead, John walked Andrew to the door and kissed him goodbye with a tenderness that made Andrew's chest ache in the best possible way. I'll call you tomorrow, John said, and Andrew knew that he would, that this wasn't the end of something but the beginning of something much more significant. 3 weeks later, Andrew found himself back in John's apartment, but this time there was no pretense about borrowed books or work projects. This time he had a key, and half his clothes were hanging in John's closet, and they had fallen into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. Andrew had had to have difficult conversations with his family about his changing understanding of his sexuality, and John had had to deal with Nancy Kelly's hurt and confusion when she learned about their relationship. There had been moments of doubt and fear, times when the newness of everything felt overwhelming, and Andrew wondered if he was making a mistake. But those moments had been overshadowed by the simple rightness of being with John, the way everything seemed to fall into place when they were together. Andrew had never experienced the kind of easy intimacy they shared, the way they could talk for hours or sit in comfortable silence, the way physical affection felt natural and unforced rather than something he had to think about and perform. Their friend group had adjusted more easily than either of them had expected, with most people expressing surprise, but also genuine happiness for them. Christine Castallo had been particularly supportive when Andrew had nervously told her about the relationship, admitting that she had always sensed something was missing between them and was glad he had figured out what that something was. Now, on a quiet Sunday morning, Andrew was making coffee in John's kitchen, while John read the newspaper at the small table by the window. The domestic routine felt both thrilling and completely natural, like something they had been doing for years rather than weeks. "You're humming," John observed, looking up from his paper with an amused smile, and Andrew realized that he was indeed humming some half-remembered song while he waited for the coffee to finish brewing. "Am I?" Andrew asked, turning to lean against the counter and study John's face in the morning light. He still sometimes felt amazed that he got to look at John like this, openly and with affection, without having to hide his feelings or worry about giving himself away. "You've been doing it a lot lately," John said, folding his paper and giving Andrew his full attention. "I like it. You seem happy." Andrew considered this observation, thinking about the way he had been feeling over the past few weeks, the sense of contentment and rightness that seemed to follow him through his days. "I am happy," he said, and the simple honesty of the statement surprised him with its clarity. "Happier than I think I've ever been." John's smile at this confession was warm and satisfied, like someone who had just received confirmation of something they had hoped was true. "Good," he said simply. "You deserve to be happy." Andrew crossed the kitchen to where John was sitting, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with morning's coffee and newspaper ink. "So do you," he said against John's hair. "Are you happy, I mean?" John reached up to cover Andrew's hand with his own, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that still sent little thrills through Andrew's nervous system. "I am," John said, tilting his head back to look at Andrew upside down. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that we almost missed this because we were both too scared to say what we were feeling." Andrew thought about this, about all the ways things could have gone differently if either of them had been less brave or more willing to accept the status quo of their friendship. The idea that they might have continued indefinitely in that state of mutual longing and uncertainty made him feel slightly sick, like they had narrowly avoided a tragedy neither of them would have even known they were experiencing. "I'm glad you called me out on the whole saying I was going to leave, but never actually leaving thing," Andrew said, straightening up but keeping his hand in John's. "I probably would have kept doing that forever if you hadn't pushed." John laughed at this, squeezing Andrew's fingers gently. "I was getting desperate," he admitted. "I kept thinking that if I could just get you to admit that you didn't really want to go, maybe we could start talking about why you were staying." The coffee maker beeped, signaling that their morning caffeine was ready, and Andrew reluctantly extracted his hand from John's to pour 2 mugs, adding cream and sugar in the proportions he had memorized over the past few weeks of shared mornings. He brought the mugs back to the table, settling in the chair across from John, and marveling again at how domestic and comfortable this all felt. "What are you thinking about?" John asked, apparently reading something in Andrew's expression that suggested deeper contemplation. "Just this," Andrew said, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen at the newspaper and coffee mugs and the way the morning light was streaming through the windows. "How normal it feels. How right. I spent so many years thinking I was broken somehow that I just wasn't capable of the kind of connection other people seem to find so easily." John's expression grew serious at this admission, and he reached across the table to take Andrew's hand again. "You weren't broken," he said firmly. "You were just looking in the wrong places, trying to force something that was never going to fit." Andrew nodded, understanding the truth of this, but still amazed by how dramatically his life had changed in such a short period of time. "It's like I've been trying to solve a puzzle with the wrong pieces for years," he said. "And then suddenly I found the right piece and everything just clicked into place." John smiled at the metaphor, bringing Andrew's hand to his lips to press a soft kiss to his knuckles. "I love the way your mind works," he said. "I love the way you think about things, the way you analyze and process, and then find these perfect ways to explain complicated feelings." Andrew felt warmth spread through his chest at the casual use of the word love, even though he knew John was talking about specific aspects of his personality rather than making a broader declaration. They hadn't said those words to each other yet, though Andrew was beginning to suspect that the feeling was there, growing stronger each day as they learned more about each other and settled into the rhythm of being together. "I love a lot of things about you, too," Andrew said, testing out the word and finding that it felt natural and right on his tongue. "I love how patient you've been with me, how you never made me feel rushed or pressured to figure everything out immediately." John's smile widened at this, and Andrew could see something shift in his expression, a kind of recognition or decision that made Andrew's heart rate increase slightly. "Andrew," John said, his voice soft but serious, and Andrew knew instinctively that they were approaching another significant moment. "Yeah," Andrew replied, though it came out more like a question, and he found himself holding his breath as he waited for whatever John was about to say. "I love you," John said simply, his eyes never leaving Andrew's face as he spoke the words that seemed to hang in the air between them like a gift waiting to be accepted. Not just things about you, but you, all of you, the way you make me feel like the best version of myself. Andrew felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes at the declaration, at the simple honesty and vulnerability in John's voice. He had known the words were coming, had felt the truth of them building between them for days, but hearing them spoken aloud still felt like a revelation, like the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I love you too, Andrew said, his voice rough with emotion, but clear and certain. I love you in ways I didn't even know were possible, in ways that make me understand why nothing else ever felt right. They sat there for a moment, hands clasped across the small kitchen table, both of them smiling through tears that felt like pure joy rather than sadness. Andrew thought about the version of himself who had stood in this same apartment 3 weeks ago, terrified to admit his feelings and convinced that he was risking everything for something that might not even be real. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, someone who had been living in black and white without realizing that color was possible. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but rather a gradual awakening to possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. A slow recognition that the thing he had been searching for had been right in front of him all along. You know, Andrew said, his voice still thick with emotion but lighter now, more playful. I think I might actually stay this time. John laughed at this, the sound bright and joyful in the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. Good, he said, bringing Andrew's hand to his lips again for another soft kiss, because I never want you to leave. And as Andrew looked at John's face, at the love and happiness and contentment reflected there, he knew with absolute certainty that he never would. He had finally found the place where he belonged, the person who made him feel whole and complete and utterly himself. And he was never going to be foolish enough to walk away from that again. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, that force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about yourself and what you wanted from life. Sometimes the person you're meant to be with has been right there all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see what was possible between you. And sometimes when you finally stop saying you should go and allow yourself to stay, you discover that home isn't a place at all, but rather a person who sees you clearly and loves you completely, exactly as you are.